Linda Rego is going to tell us a lot about the history of the Cow Palace down on Lighthouse Road and about some of the work she has been doing trying to get it put on the National Registry of Historic Places. Her daughter and son-in-law own the Cow Palace, so she's been very interested in finding out more about it. She's done a lot of research, has found pictures, and she is very willing to share with us and would like anyone else to share who has stories about the Cow Palace or information about it. So, Linda?
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's really been so helpful and supportive of me. Oh my goodness, because Kathy and Diane Coos Littlefield and Danny Harrison and Marcia and Vern Thompson. I mean, everywhere anything that I ask, gee, where could I find this? Or, I just get tons of information, and I'm so very, very grateful. So I wanted to start with that. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story on Cape Jellison, and then we'll, move on to the Cow Palace and my story with the Cow Palace. My family's been spending part of every summer on Cape Jellison since the 1970s, since the late 70s. I came with my parents and my small children, and we rented over on Rocky Point, used to be Squaw Point, over on that side, and we rented from the Turners and the Townleys and the Danny Dannenbaum. And then when we couldn't do that anymore, we went over to the other side on Fort Point, and we rented a wonderful house from Susie Goddard. So we were, every summer we came. And then in 2017, my daughter and her husband bought the Cow Palace, which was like a dream come true for me. And so we come every summer, and so this is the fourth generation to spend the summers on Cape Jellison with my granddaughter. So Cape Jellison sort of feels like a second home for us. And so the Cow Palace is a big house. It's an interesting house. And I was just intrigued about all sorts of things. And when I started to do a little bit of digging around, I thought this really is a special place, and it's survived a lot. So I got in touch with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and Michael Goebel-Bain is the architectural historian there, and he suggested that I download this form from the internet, which is the National Register Eligibility Assessment Form that anybody can download. And it's 3 or 4 pages of things to tell about the property and to get started. So I did that, and then he came and looked at the property, and he said, great. He said, okay, we're going to bring it to the committee, and then they decide if it's worthy of being listed, and then the state has to recommend it nationally. And so I got a nice letter from him saying that they're going to do that, and already it's listed on the Maine Historic Resources Inventory. So we've come that far. And then he said to me, oh yeah, all of that oral history is really interesting. I want facts. So yeah, everybody says it was built in 1867. Tell me the facts. So I had to go. My husband and I went and spent a couple of days in Belfast at in the deeds and things like that. And what I found was very exciting for me because it was Lucina Webster who bought the land and built the Cow Palace. And everything that I'd heard from everybody was Paul D. Webster was a a lumber baron from Bangor. He actually was from Orono, but and he built the Cow Palace. No, it was his wife, Lucina. And I have a story that I tell myself, which I have no facts for, but they closed on the property, and she paid $300 to James Littlefield on December 28th, 1866. And my story I tell myself was, she's been saying, I want a cottage, I want a summer cottage. And Paul said, okay, here's a summer cottage for Christmas. And then they settled. I have no facts to back that up. So we know that it was built between 1866 and 1870 because Paul D. Webster bought land that was described as adjacent to the house. The property was adjacent to the house. And so we know that. And so Michael Goebel Baines in Augusta says, well, why did they build a house there? And I don't have that answer yet, but I'm working on it. But we know in 1859 that all of that point was owned by a man named, I'm sure you know more than I do, Randall, Randell. It's spelled like about 5 ways. Okay. And then that was in 1859, the official map of Stockton Springs. And then by 1866, it had been divided into lots. And so sometime between there, it was divided into lots. And I don't have that information yet. I have to do more digging. We know a lot, I know a lot more that Kathy has shared with me about development of that area in the 1880s and even in the late 70s, but not that early. So also, in addition to being an old house and still in pretty good condition and being used the way it was built, it has to have a national significance. And I thought the national significance would be that the Army requisitioned it during World War II, and it was a base, headquarters of an Army base out there, and they had cannons all along Fort Point, and the officers stayed in the house, of course, right? And there were tents all around with soldiers, and it was the headquarters. And the question I asked myself was, why in the world would there would be German submarines up here, you know? And then, of course, I found out that we're the closest place to Europe. Maine sticks out like that. And troop ships would fuel in Searsport before they went to Europe because this was the closest place. And
they were sending ammunition and bombs from Searsport.
From Searsport too, yeah. And so there were.
Just down here, I didn't know it.
Yeah, go ahead. Please jump in anytime, please. Yeah.
And my uncle worked on
There, yeah, there you go. So that, I thought, well, that's a national significance. And then the historic preservation people in Augusta, and this Michael Goebel Baines, he said no, he thinks, that of course was historic, but he thinks the reason that the Cow Palace should be listed is it's one of the very first, if not the first, house that was built in mid-coast Maine specifically as a summer cottage. And I did exactly the same thing. Oh? And what he told me was that before the Civil War and up until like 1860, people would come from Boston and Philadelphia and New York, and they would rent or buy houses that were already here. And it wasn't until the 1860s that this idea came, oh, we're going to build a house just to be a summer house, which I didn't know that at all. So that's, let me see what I forgot. Wendell. So the question is, why did Paul D. Webster build, and Lucina, I should have started, why did Lucina, with the help of Paul D. Webster, build the Cow Palace? And I don't have any letters. I don't have any specific, I'd love to find a letter where he says, oh, we're going to do this because, but I don't. The only thing I can speculate is that Paul D. Webster was a very rich man. He was what they call a lumber baron. His father had, in the 1700s, the Webster Plantation, which was a great big piece of land north of Orono. And his name was Ethan. I have a funny story about it. Pamela probably wouldn't want to hear it, but I read it in a book last week. And they were very prominent. And Paul D. Webster was an elected member of the Maine legislature. He was also a banker. And the big hotel, the Wamskeg, how do you pronounce it?
Sumkiag, I think.
Okay, that hotel.
But go by one of the other names, Fort Point House.
Fort Point Hotel, right, the big hotel.
Yeah.
Was built in 1871, and the builder and architect was J.W. Thompson, who lived here in Stockton Springs. And so I am sure that the Websters up in Orono, who was a banker, a member of the legislature, had the scuttlebutt. Oh, they're going to be developing a big hotel there. That's probably going to be a summer community. That's probably going to be a place to build a hotel. But I don't, that's just my story. So I've got to do more research on that. So it was built in 1867, between 66 and 70. So, and the oral history around here has been 1867, and that's what it says over the lighthouse. And then the Websters had the house until through the Second World War. And the last Webster was Charlie Webster. And then it was, after Charlie died, it was inherited by his two nephews, and they sold it. And they sold it to the Wardwell family. And that's when it became known as the Cow Palace, because the story I've been told by a couple people was that G. Colby Wardwell, somebody told me that's what they called him, I don't know, but yeah, was driving around and he saw this sign that said Cow Palace over a barn. He liked it and he went up and said, can I buy the sign? The woman said, yes. And he brought it back and put it on the Cow Palace. And I don't even know if he wanted to call the house the Cow Palace, but the barn is so prominent, so everybody who drives by, they see that sign and they go, oh, it's the Cow Palace. And actually, one of the granddaughters from the Wardwell family told me that the family called it the Point. You know, we're going out to the Point. So that's what they called it. And the Wardwells owned it until the late 80s, 1989, I believe. And Mrs. Celia Wardwell lived there. And I was driving one day from over at Rocky Point. The house was full of kids and dogs and loud noises and everything, and I said, I'm going to get out of here. I got to go have some peace and quiet. So I drove down the road, and I know most of you can remember when it was a dirt road, and it was like a washboard road, bum, 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 and it, you know, when you drove down. And I saw a little sign that said, blueberries for sale, knock at the kitchen door. So I did, and I met Mrs. Wardwell, Celia Wardwell, and bought blueberries, and we struck up a conversation, and I visited her several times. And I've heard she was quite a character, and she was really prickly, but she was very nice to me. And we had coffee and chatted. And I would bring my children over to that wonderful beach there. There's that Crescent Beach. And in those days, you could just pull off the road and go down on the beach. And that was a really good beach for sea glass because, you know, all those houses and everything, you know, were over there in the old days. So, and then she sold she left it to two granddaughters. She apparently had raised her granddaughters because her daughter had died young, and they were very young. They were like in their 20s, I think, and they sold it. And a man named Manly Rogers and his wife bought it, and they had it as a B&B. And they also, I've been told, rented it out for weddings and things like that. So it was for that. And then several more people owned it. And then like I said, my daughter and her husband bought it. And my son-in-law was willing to take on a big house like that because his business is restoring historic houses in Savannah, Georgia. And so we come in the summer. We're not here in the winter. We're not hardy like you guys. We don't know if we could take your winters, so so when the weather turns bad, we leave. But it's a beautiful house, and I brought a lot of pictures that I hope you'll look at of early pictures of the house, and they were taken by a woman named Harriet Hitchborn, who was a well-known photographer, and she took pictures of the Cow Palace and all sorts of things. And this is a picture of the steamer that brought people, and this was at Kidder Point. They let people off at Kidder Point, and the next stop was Fort Point. So I thought that was.
Can I just
Mm-hmm.
Awesome to hear it. Is that good?
So those are the things, and I wasn't going to talk this long. So anybody want to share stories about the Cow Palace? Please.
Before you guys bought it, I cleaned for the people who owned it before you,
Yeah.
and the guy, the son, was telling me about one of the rooms, and that it was a sea captain that had lived there, and that somebody had been murdered, and so his wife keeps coming back and is haunted in that room. I've cleaned many times and never seen anything.
Good. I'm glad. And I don't even want to know which room. So, but that's always a good story. Yeah. Diane?
I've never heard anything like that. I've been around a long time.
Can I tell your story, or do you want to, about your grandmother?
My grandmother and my mother. Well, okay. I was born right down on Seaport Avenue, almost 92 years ago. Anyway, one summer my grandmother was the housekeeper for G. Colby Wadwell, and my mother in her teens was the maid. So my grandmother, they stayed there for the summer, and Grammy would cook. And my mother had to dress up in a little maid outfit with a little cap and serve his meals. Then she went down in the field where that beautiful gazebo was.
It still is there. Mm-hmm.
It's still down there.
Mm, behind that house.
There's a big house now between you.
Yeah,
can't see.
yeah.
And then he loved homemade donuts that Grammy made. Well, she got tired of making donuts every day. So she'd take two from the day before, put them in a brown paper bag, put a little water in, put them in the oven, take my hands. Oh, he said, I just love you making new fresh donuts every day.
Okay, I've got to write that one down. I love that. Oh. Well, Vern Thompson told me his mother or his grandmother owned a little store down there. Yeah, and that that people would come in their big fancy cars to their summer houses, and they would stop and buy things from her store on their way, out to Fort Point. And it really was I think what they were trying to do is make it into another Bar Harbor and a really, fancy summer colony, because
Wasn't that before Bar Harbor?
Bar Harbor soup, because the people who had cottages along there, I've got this came from the Stockton Springs Historical Society upstairs, and I copied it, is that they had cottages along there with the governor of Massachusetts and the owner of the Boston Brave baseball team, and Captain Sanford of Bangor, who owned the Sanford steamship line. So they were very prominent people who had cottages, and what I heard was that when the Depression came, a lot of the families couldn't keep the cottages, and they just disintegrated. A couple of them burned, and they're just
I
no.
remember the Webster cottage.
Pardon?
I remember the Webster.
Yes, it was next door. Charlie Webster bought it,
Yeah.
and he was the son of the people at the Cow Palace. So I don't know if it was a.
I don't think anybody was living there when I was.
Yeah, I have a picture of it, and it's pretty much of a ruin.
Charlie Webster, I don't know if he's still alive or not, but he was head of the
Really?
Yes, very, very active in politics, and he actually was an appointee to a position by Governor LePage. When the
Yeah.
governor,
So I'm sure it's the same family.
yeah,
And when the Websters from California came and knocked on my door, they brought, this is fun. Yeah, you can pass those around. And this is the picture that I love the best. Uncle Charlie, his chauffeur Coos, and family enjoy a weekend at Fort Point in 1910.
That's my uncle.
And that was Diane's uncle who was the chauffeur. Isn't that fun? You can pass those around. And I'll let you pass these around too, so maybe we'll do it this way. You can pass them this way.
So this is exactly what this, do you know?
So,
That's the point.
and then there's more up here if you want to come. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy.
so, what's the status of the application for it to be on the National Historic Register?
Okay, this is this. I got this letter last year from in September, and what he says, I'm pleased to say that in our judgment, based on the information and photos submitted, this property is eligible for the nomination for the National Register of Historic Places. The building is significant locally as an early summer cottage. The period significance is 1867. And so he just recently told me that they're going to be doing the nomination in September and submitting it in October. So that's, and he said, in the meantime, the property is already listed on the Maine Historic Resources Inventory. So,
Is there a way to find that out? Like, if there's certain places on that inventory, like there must be.
there must be, if you get in touch with the Historic Preservation Commission in Augusta.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Okay.
When was the lighthouse built?
Well, I have some information about this, but I have to look it up. So somebody will probably tell you because they know more. It was built in 1759.
So
Yeah, the house was built in 1857, and the bell tower in 1890, and it was, and then in 1988 it was made automatic. You know, there's nobody that turns it on. I guess they do it from a distance, but
And the lighthouse that was built in the late 1700s was rebuilt in the early 1800s.
yeah, I
I
didn't
don't
know.
know if it was the original one or the second one was built by a Joseph Barry who built a lot of the lighthouses along the coast. And the James Barry who settled here in the late 1700s was, I think, a great-grandnephew. So,
Right, so that was all.
yeah.
There were parts of that, because that lighthouse is pretty unique in that it's squared outside
Yes.
but round inside.
Interesting.
I wonder if the round part is older than, you know, the square one.
And the square was put on.
I don't know. Nobody knows. Yeah, thanks.
I'm sorry, but I have to complain. His name is spelled C-O-O-S-E. They've got K.
Okay.
Oh, well, they didn't know. No, they
And this is a 1998 article that was from the Republican Journal about the restoration that the Manley Rogers did. Yeah, so that's up there too. What else can I? Well, this is a picture. This is from upstairs at the Historical Society, but it's the front porch of the big hotel, the Fort Point House. So, okay. That's it from me.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. And there are other things you might want to come up here and see. Linda has made a pretty good collection of items both for herself and to have at the house for people who come to find out more about the house. And I would also like to say that there are a few things on the showcase in the meeting room that came from the Charlie Libby collection, because his 100th anniversary of his birth was July 23rd this year.
Oh, nice.
And this information was thanks to Faith. And because of that, I thought, as did the board, that we should have at least some mention of that fact. And we received a huge postcard collection and a lot of other information from Charlie Libby. So there are just a very few things on the showcase. And there will be refreshments and time to look at everything up here. So thank you so much, Linda.
Well, thank you for having me.